In this video, I'll provide an overview of our discussion board this week, along with our Part 3 inferential statistics of our research project. So here we are on our home page, and I'll go ahead and click on Weekly Modules. So go ahead and scrolling down. We are now in week 12. And so the video that you're watching right now is this link right here, so you can always go back to it if you want to review this video. Here's the Chapter 10 resources, our discussion board, the worksheet that I've created to help you with your discussion board this week. Here is Part 3, which is your business memo on your inferential statistics that's due on Sunday, November 11th, and then the other assignments, your quiz and your homework. So recall that the purpose of the discussion boards is to get you not to procrastinate and to get you started on your assignments before they're actually due. So your discussion board with your hypothesis test is due on Thursday, and then you'll get feedback from your peers so that on Sunday, when you put together your business memo, you can submit it with based on good feedback. If you don't want to wait for your peers and their feedback, you can submit earlier. Just note that you won't have the advantage of getting their feedback. Let's go ahead and click on the discussion board 10. So in discussion board 9, or last week's discussion board, you had to develop a hypothesis test. So in this week's discussion board, you're now going to run that hypothesis test. Now, you could have done a hypothesis of a mean or an average, or you could have done a hypothesis test of a proportion. If we click on this, this is the inferential statistics worksheet that I have created so that you can follow along as you work on your hypothesis test. So this is what the worksheet looks like. In the top half is the instructions on how to do a hypothesis test for a population mean. It's a fill in the blank. You just want to make sure you answer every piece. For Part A, there's 3 decision rules. You just have to pick the one that applies to your hypothesis test. If we scroll down, you can see this is the critical value method approach to make your conclusion, as well as the p-value approach and the different formulas that you'll need depending on what you're doing, depending on your type of hypothesis test. If we keep scrolling down, this is the instructions for a hypothesis test of a population proportion. Again, you just want to fill out all the pieces. In Part A, I give you all 3 decision rules depending on the type of test, because I don't know what everyone's hypothesis test is going to look like, so I'm providing as much information as possible so you can just pick and choose what you need. Again, all the formulas are available here, and you should get your conclusion using both the critical value method and the p-value approach. So make sure to contact me if you need help working on the worksheet. But going back, so how are we going to actually do our hypothesis tests? Well, I've created 2 videos. So clicking here, you'll see the video on how to do a hypothesis test of a population mean. And clicking on this video, you'll see a video on how to do a hypothesis test for a population proportion. Once you've watched those videos and used the worksheet and filled it out based on your Airbnb data, please don't use outside data. It's supposed to be the Airbnb files that I gave you that you've cleaned over the last semester, you've been analyzing, you've created some charts, pie charts, bar charts, you've developed averages and proportions, hopefully. And now you're just going to conduct your hypothesis test. So here is an example of my hypothesis test written out in the discussion board. So for instance, my hypothesis test about the average price per night in Ville Marie as a neighborhood of Montreal, where I want to open a bike and wine or beer tour. So my hypothesis test is that it's going to equal $120 a night or not equal $120 a night. The reason why I use equals is because I don't know which direction it's going to be, greater or less than. So by doing equals, not equals, I will find out either way. And the $120 came from a Travel Budget Montreal website. Now, you could have picked that number based on some other rationale. Maybe you've traveled somewhere before and that's how much you paid. Someone mentioned it to you. You've done other research. So I explain here all the parts of my hypothesis test. What was my alpha level? What was my hypothesized population mean? So that's the same number here. What was my sample size, my sample mean, my sample standard deviation? What was the critical t-value I found using Excel? And what was my test statistic using the formula to convert my sample mean into a t-test statistic? Then here's my conclusion, where I will compare my test statistic against my critical value and whether or not I reject the null and what it means for my business. it's really important that we understand how to communicate hypothesis testing as in terms of the results. Now, all of these pieces you have to include because I need to verify that you did your hypothesis test correctly. If you do not provide all of these pieces, you will not get credit for the discussion board. Similarly, all this content will then be copied and pasted into your business memo for your part 3 after you've made any tweaks if your peers have made suggestions on how to improve your hypothesis test. Scrolling down, here's an example of a hypothesis test of a proportion. So again, I write out my hypothesis test for a proportion is about listings in Ville Marie of Montreal that are apartments for my bike and wine beer tour. So my null and alternative hypotheses is based on the fact that I think the population proportion is going to be greater than 0.8 or 80% apartments in my Airbnb dataset. Now, I use this number because I want a densely populated urban neighborhood. And so again, I do the same thing. I provide all of my pieces from the worksheet, my alpha level, my hypothesized population proportion, the sample size, my X and my N, as well as my sample proportion, my critical Z value, whether you do it from Appendix F or Excel, and the calculated test statistic. And then I write a sentence or two around my conclusion of whether or not we reject the null and what it means for my business. Now, for the peer post, please help someone out by analyzing and commenting on their post. Please do not say, I like your hypothesis test. I'd like you to actually check their calculations. Not only should you be running your own hypothesis test, you should know how to verify someone else's hypothesis tests. In a company, you can't take everyone's numbers at face value. Oftentimes you want to audit and verify that they've done it correctly and not just made up a number. So here I'm asking for at least one of the other posts, take the numbers that they've provided and plug it into the formula and see if they compared their test statistic and critical values correctly. If you see an error, offer the correction and if it's correct, tell them you verified it and it's correct. You are welcome to comment on more than one peer post if you like, but try to post to someone who hasn't received a peer response yet. Now, as an incentive to practice checking hypothesis test results, if you find an error in someone else's calculations and correct it, that means you're going above and beyond. Not only are you verifying their hypothesis test, but you're actually explaining to them how to fix it. I will give you 5 extra credit points. This is extra work, and you deserve credit for it if you do it. And that's the discussion board for week 10. Now let's go ahead and switch over to the actual assignment though. So here's part 3 of our inferential statistics assignment, and I've got the link to the instructions if you want to go back to it, but the instructions are just down below here. I also have the links to the 2 videos on how to conduct a hypothesis test of a mean and a proportion, because in case you didn't do the discussion board, you at least have the resources so you can conduct your hypothesis test for this assignment. So you're going to be asked to write a 1 to 2 page single-space business memo with the following pieces. First, explain your confidence interval estimate that you developed in your discussion board 8. So recall you developed a confidence interval estimate for the average price per night, and you just now want to explain what it means for your business. In part 2, this is where you developed a hypothesis test, and so this was based on your discussion board 9, whether it was a hypothesis test of a mean or a proportion. And then in item 3, this is where you're going to explain your conclusions. So remember that in order to get inferential statistics, you have to conduct a hypothesis test. So make sure to explain all the components in your hypothesis test, such as your null and alternative hypotheses, your alpha, your sample size, your population mean or proportion, and your sample mean or proportion. This is essentially the content from the discussion board 10 that I showed earlier in the video. I also include the link to the worksheet again if you need assistance. Lastly, what's the overall business implications? In other words, what do your findings suggest you should do for your business? Again, this is just your discussion board 10. So you can see that this assignment is just compiling the discussion boards 8, 9, and 10 in a professional business memo based on the feedback that you received from your peers and your instructor. So if you have any questions, just let me know.